The gun was already cocked when Mamie Dawson walked through the door of the Talbot Ranch house, and the woman holding it had eyes like chipped flint and a mouth twisted with something uglier than anger. "You have no right to be here," the woman said. Her name was Vera Crane, and half the town of Dustfall, New Mexico Territory, seemed to think she practically owned the Talbot property by virtue of her intentions toward Homer Talbot. "You have no past, no name worth speaking, and no future on this land." "I asked around, Miss Dawson. Nobody knows a single soul who can speak for you. You have no references. No one can say where you came from or who your people are or what you left behind. And yet here you stand under Homer's roof like you belong." Mamie did not step backward. She had learned, somewhere in the long and nameless years before this moment, that stepping backward invited pursuit. She stood in the doorway with the afternoon light at her back and the barrel of Vera Crane's pistol pointed at the hollow of her throat, and she said nothing, because there was no story she wanted to tell. There never had been. "Get out," Vera said. "Get out before Homer comes back and makes a fool of himself over a woman who won't even tell him her own history." The door swung wider on its leather hinges, pushed by a gust rolling in off the Sangre de Cristo foothills, and in that sudden wash of dry, sage-scented air Homer Talbot stepped in from behind Mamie. He did not look at Vera's gun. He looked at Mamie's face, reading it the way a careful man reads weather, and what he found there made his jaw set and his shoulders drop, not in defeat, but in a particular kind of stillness that men who have survived difficult things carry instead of aggression. "Vera," he said, his voice low and flat as a board laid across a stream, "put that down. She has no references, Homer. She has no story. You don't know a single thing about this woman." "I know enough," he said. And he did not elaborate. He asked for neither her references nor her story. He simply stepped around Mamie, placed his broad, calloused hand over the barrel of Vera's pistol, and held it there until Vera's grip loosened and her face crumpled from fury into something more honest and more sorrowful. He took the gun gently, as a man might take something fragile from a child who does not realize it is fragile, and he set it on the side table near the door without ever raising his voice. That moment, suspended in the dust-moted light of a late October afternoon in 1883, was not the beginning of their story. It was closer to the midpoint. To understand how Mamie Dawson came to stand in that doorway with a gun at her throat, and a man stepping around her like a wall, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the day the southbound stage rattled into Dustfall, and Mamie stepped off it with a single carpetbag, $17 folded small inside her boot, and a name she had been using long enough that it almost felt like her own. Dustfall was not a town that inspired confidence. It had been thrown up at the intersection of two trade routes in the mid-1870s, and it had the architectural character of something assembled in a hurry by people who had not intended to stay. The main street was a quarter-mile of hard-packed caliche, flanked on either side by false-fronted buildings that leaned at their own private angles, like men in a saloon at the end of a long night. There was a general store run by a man named Aldous Fitch who weighed everything twice and smiled when he did it. There was a livery stable. There was a dry goods merchant. There was a hotel called the Creosote Arms, which had 8 rooms and a dining room that smelled permanently of scorched coffee and rendered lard. There was a marshal's office, though the marshal himself was rarely in it. And there was the Dustfall Saloon, which had no secondary name, as if the town itself was the vice. Mamie stepped down from the stage and stood for a moment on the packed earth of the street, letting the dust settle around her boots. She had been on stages and trains and the beds of freight wagons for better than 3 weeks, moving west and south by turns, putting miles between herself and a life she had no intention of revisiting. She was 26 years old, and she was tired in a way that had very little to do with the journey, and almost everything to do with what she was journeying away from. She had a face that men noticed, and then looked at a second time with more attention than the first glance warranted, not because she was conventionally beautiful in any parlor print way, but because There was something in her expression that suggested she was thinking about three things at once and would not tell you what any of them were. Her hair was dark brown and practical, pinned up against the heat. Her eyes were a gray that shifted toward green depending on the light, and on a bright October afternoon in dustfall, they were the color of sage after rain. She needed work. She needed work urgently, because $17 would last her approximately 12 days at the Creosote Arms, and she had no intention of spending even 12 days idle. Idleness allowed memory to surface, and memory was the one luxury she could not afford. She asked at the general store first. Aldous Fitch looked her over with the same doubly careful attention he gave his scale weights and said he had no positions available, though his wife needed help with the laundry, which paid in meals rather than money. Mamie thanked him and declined. She tried the dry goods merchant, who explained that his daughter did all his bookkeeping and his son managed the floor, and that he wished her good luck with a sincerity that suggested he thought she would need it. It was in the dining room of the Creosote Arms, over a plate of pinto beans and a piece of cornbread that she had spent 50 cents on, that she overheard the conversation that changed everything. Two men were seated at the table behind her, talking with the comfortable volume of people who had drunk enough coffee to forget that the room carried sound. One of them, she gathered from context, was the owner of a dry goods hauling operation. The other was someone named Calloway, who seemed to function as a general clearinghouse for town information. Calloway was explaining, at some length, that Homer Talbot was in a difficult situation. Homer Talbot ran the largest cattle operation in the eastern approaches of the territory, occupying a ranch some 4 miles outside Dustfall that his father had established in 1869, and that Homer had built into something genuinely substantial over the past decade. He ran good cattle, paid fair wages, and had the reputation of a man who kept his word so consistently that it had become less a virtue than a simple fact of him, like the color of his eyes. The difficult situation was this. His housekeeper of 11 years, a widow named Mrs. Gantry, had gone to live with her daughter in Santa Fe after a fall that left her unable to manage the work, and Homer Talbot had not found a suitable replacement in the 3 months since. The ranch house, according to Calloway, was sliding into the particular disorder that befalls a dwelling when a capable woman has left it, and no capable woman has arrived to take her place. Homer had advertised in the Dustfall Gazette and received no qualified applicants. He had written to an agency in Albuquerque and been told there was a waiting period of several months for household placement. He was, Calloway concluded, eating his own cooking, which was reportedly catastrophic, and managing the domestic side of a 12-man operation on sheer will and diminishing morale. Mamie ate her beans and listened. She was not a housekeeper, technically. She had been, among other things, a seamstress's assistant, a schoolroom aide, a cook's helper in a railroad boarding house, and for 8 months that she did not think about if she could avoid it, a bookkeeper for a man whose business she had eventually understood was not legitimate. She could cook adequately, could manage a household with intelligence and system, could keep accounts, and could handle the kind of quiet authority that large households required. What she could not provide was a letter of reference from any of those positions, because providing one would require establishing a verifiable chain of employment that led backward toward things she needed to stay behind. She finished her beans, wiped her hands on the rough cotton napkin, and decided to present herself at the Talbot Ranch in the morning. She hired a horse from the livery stable for $1 and found the ranch without difficulty, following the road Calloway had described with enough detail that she suspected he described it to everyone who would listen. The property declared itself gradually. First the fence line, cedar posts strung with wire, then the windmill turning slow in the morning air, then the outbuildings, and then the house itself, which was adobe and timber, larger than she expected, with a wide porch running the full length of the south face and an enormous cottonwood in the yard that had turned October gold. Homer Talbot was in the yard when she rode in, talking to a man in a canvas jacket about something that involved a fence post and some apparent disagreement about its depth. He was not quite what she had pictured from Calloway's description. She had imagined someone older, perhaps more careworn. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she judged, with a build that was the result of actual physical labor rather than deliberate cultivation. He was not a handsome man in the way that idle men sometimes contrive to be, but he was the kind of man who occupied his own physical presence so completely that you stopped cataloging his features and simply noted that he was there. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and when he looked up from the fence post-discussion and saw her riding in, his expression was attentive without being aggressive. The man in the canvas jacket said something Mamie did not catch and walked toward the outbuildings. Homer Talbot approached her horse. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I heard in town that you were looking for a housekeeper." He looked at her directly, without the sliding assessment she had encountered from Fitch and the dry goods merchant. "I am," he said. "I'd like to apply for the position." He nodded, as if this were a piece of information that fit naturally into a sequence he had been expecting. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." The coffee was, as advertised by Calloway, not good, but he made it without apology and set it in front of her at the kitchen table with a directness that she appreciated. The kitchen itself told her everything she needed to know about the domestic situation: capable bones, substantial neglect. Good iron pots hanging in a logical order, but the floor unwashed, the shelves unorganized, a smell of stale grease, and the particular staleness of a room that has been inhabited by people who are managing rather than living. He sat across from her with his own cup and said, "I want to know your experience." She told him what she could, which was actually quite a lot. She told him about the railroad boarding house because it was the most useful and the least problematic, explaining the scale of the cooking operation, the number of men fed daily, the management of supplies and accounts. She told him about the seamstress's shop because it demonstrated attention to detail. She did not mention the bookkeeping position or the man whose business it was. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is actually processing what he has heard rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Then he said, "References." She met his eyes. "No," she said. "I have none that I'm able to provide." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was simply present, the way a room is present. "No story you'd like to tell me about that?" he asked. His voice was neutral, not unkind. "No," she said. "I'm sorry, there isn't." Homer Talbot turned his coffee cup a quarter turn in his hands and looked at it. "The last person I had in this house worked here for 11 years, he said. "I knew her family. I knew her late husband. I knew everything about her, and it still didn't tell me anything I hadn't learned in the first month from simply watching her work." He set the cup down. "I'll pay you $30 a month, room and board included. The room is the second door on the left at the end of the hall. It has a good window. I'll want breakfast before 5 and supper at 7, and something cold left out for the men at midday during roundup. If the arrangement doesn't suit you or doesn't suit me after the first month, we part ways without ill feeling. Can you start today?" She said she could start today. She rode back to Dustfall, collected her carpetbag from the Creosote Arms, returned her horse to the livery stable, and was back at the ranch by early afternoon. She started with the kitchen. There was something clarifying about work of that particular kind. It was the kind of work that had no dark corners, no hidden motive, no secret architecture. You cleaned a surface and the surface was clean. You organized a shelf and the things on it were findable. You lit a stove and the heat came and the food cooked and the men ate. Mamie had always found in the years of her complicated and peripatetic life that domestic work was the most honest thing available to her, because it asked only for her hands and her attention, and it gave back visible results. She spent the first afternoon on the kitchen and the pantry, the second morning on the main room and the dining room, and by the end of her third day at the Talbot Ranch, she had established a system that the house seemed to exhale into with relief. Homer Talbot watched all of this without comment, which was exactly the right response. He was a man who understood, at some cellular level, that capable people did not need to be supervised and did not benefit from praise offered prematurely. He left her to it. He was in the yard or the fields or the outbuildings from before dawn until well past supper, and he came in to eat with the thoroughness of a man who has been working genuinely hard and needs fuel rather than experience. He said the food was good. He said it simply, without flourish, and returned to whatever he had been reading or calculating at the far end of the table. On the fifth evening he lingered. He had a ledger open on the table, and he was working through something in it with a pencil, and Mamie was washing the last of the supper dishes at the basin. She was aware of him in the room in the way she was always aware of him, which had less to do with attraction at that early stage than with the simple fact that he was a contained and substantial presence, and she had become, over years of necessity, attuned to the particulars of the people she lived among. "You're comfortable here?" he asked, without looking up from the ledger. "Yes," she said, "very. The room is adequate. It's fine, more than fine." He made a notation in the ledger. "One of the men will drive into Dustfall on Saturday for supplies. If you need anything for the household, give him a list." "I'll have one ready," she said. There was a pause that might have been the end of the conversation, and then he said, still looking at the ledger, "You ever been in New Mexico territory before?" She dried her hands on the towel hanging from the rack. "No," she said, which was true. "It's particular country," he said. "Takes some getting used to. The sky is bigger than you think you can tolerate, and then one day you realize you can't tolerate a smaller sky anymore." He closed the ledger. "My father said that. He came here from Virginia in 1863 before the war was entirely finished. Said he needed more sky than Virginia could provide." He stood, tucking the pencil behind his ear. "Good night, Miss Dawson." "Good night, Mr. Talbot." He was halfway to the hallway when she said, without planning to say it, "My father came from the East too, a long time ago." He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was careful in a way she recognized as something other than simple courtesy. It was the expression of a man who understood that a door had been opened, however slightly, and who was choosing not to rush through it. "Good country to come to," he said. And then he said good night again and went down the hallway and left her alone in the kitchen with the last of the lamplight and the sound of the wind moving over the roof. She stood there for a moment, surprised at herself. She had not talked about her father in 3 years. She had not talked about anything personal in longer than that, or so it felt. She had been moving so quickly and so determinedly away from the wreckage of what she'd left behind that she had forgotten, somewhere in the process, that people said things about themselves sometimes. That small pieces of truth could be offered without catastrophe. She folded the dish towel carefully over the rack and went to her room. The days found a rhythm. She learned the patterns of the ranch, which was itself a kind of story, told in the movement of cattle and horses and men and weather. She learned which of the hired hands were reliable, and which required management from a careful distance. That particular kind of management that involved making a man think he was making decisions that you had already arranged for him to make. She learned that Homer Talbot was trusted by his men in the way that certain kinds of authority earn trust, not through fear or reward, but through a consistent evidence of good judgment. When he said something would work, it worked. When he said a situation was serious, it was serious. The men did not test him because testing him had never yielded a different result than the one he'd predicted. She also learned Vera Crane. Vera arrived at the ranch on Mamie's second Wednesday there, driving a buggy with a confident authority that suggested she had been driving it up this road for a long time. She was a handsome woman in her early 30s, with red gold hair and the complexion of someone who had been pretty in youth and knew how to extend it. She ran a property of her own, Mamie gathered, a smaller spread to the north, left to her by a husband who had died of a fever 2 winters past. She and Homer had been neighbors for years, and it was apparent from the way she walked through the front door of the ranch house that she had formed certain expectations about her eventual relationship to its interior. She found Mamie in the kitchen. The look she gave Mamie was the look of a woman who has encountered a complication she had not anticipated and is rapidly calculating its significance. It lasted only a moment, and then it was replaced by a careful pleasantness that was more dangerous than open hostility because it required more intelligence to sustain. "You must be the new housekeeper," Vera said. "Yes, Mamie Dawson. Vera Crane. I'm a neighbor." She set a basket on the table, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a pie. "I brought this for Homer. Is he in?" "He's out at the south fence line with 2 of the men," Mamie said. "He'll be back before supper. You're welcome to wait." Vera looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of a woman assessing improvements that she might have made differently. "You've been busy," she said. "It needed some organization," Mamie said. "Mrs. Gantry ran things in her own way," Vera said, in a tone that suggested Mrs. Gantry's way was the correct way, regardless of evidence. Mamie said nothing to that and offered tea, which Vera accepted, and they sat at the table in the particular tension of 2 women who have immediately understood each other without exchanging any real information. Vera asked where Mamie was from with the brightness of someone who expects the question to be answered. "East," Mamie said. "East where?" "Kentucky originally," Mamie said, which was true. "And before here, what were you doing before?" "Working," Mamie said. "Different positions." "References?" Vera asked. Homer asked for references, of course. "He made his own assessment," Mamie said evenly. Vera's eyes sharpened. The pleasantness became slightly more effortful. "Of course," she said. "Homer is perceptive." When Homer came in an hour later and found Vera at the table with the remains of a tea service between them and a tension in the air that he apparently recognized by scent, he greeted Vera with the warmth of long familiarity and thanked her for the pie, and offered no particular commentary on the situation. Mamie excused herself to start supper and left them in the kitchen, and from the hallway she could hear Vera's voice drop into a more intimate register that was clearly not intended for Mamie's ears, though the walls of an adobe house are not ultimately private. She did not listen deliberately. She moved away down the hall, but she heard Vera say, with a precision that was plainly calculated, "I asked around about her, Homer. Nobody in Dustfall knows a thing about her. She has no references and no story she's willing to tell." She heard Homer's voice, lower and harder to read. She did not catch the words. Whatever he said, Vera left shortly after, and Homer came to the kitchen doorway while Mamie was working on supper and leaned against the frame with his arms folded in the posture of a man who is about to say something that he has been composing for the last 10 minutes. "Vera tells me she's asked around about you," he said. Mamie looked up from the potatoes she was cutting. "I figured she would," she said. "She's protective," he said. "Of me, she thinks. Of herself, mostly. That's not a criticism." "I understood that," Mamie said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hired you based on my own assessment. That stands. I'm not asking you to explain yourself." She looked at him. He was not asking. He meant it. She could see that he meant it with the same uncomplicated directness that characterized every other thing she had observed him say and do in the week and a half she had been at the ranch. He was not performing generosity or restraint. He simply, genuinely did not require her history as a condition of her employment. "Thank you," she said. And then, because something in the way he was standing in the doorway made her want to offer something in return, she said, "I'm not dangerous. Whatever my past looks like from the outside, I'm not dangerous." He unfolded his arms and pushed off the doorframe. "I know that," he said, as if it were obvious, as if the idea that she might be dangerous had not seriously presented itself to him. "Supper smells good," he said, and walked away, and Mamie turned back to her potatoes with something she had not felt in years moving around in her chest, warm and inconvenient and not entirely unwelcome. The weeks that followed were the quietest she had spent in a long time. Not quiet in the sense of uneventful, because a working cattle ranch in the final push before winter is a busy and sometimes chaotic place, but quiet in the sense of a particular interior peace that she had stopped expecting to find. There was the work, which was honest and satisfying. There was the country, which Homer had described accurately. The sky was enormous and initially alarming and then gradually necessary. There was the particular pleasure of being trusted with a household and managing it well. And there was Homer. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not make declarations or gestures, but he was observant in a way that registered quietly over time, like water working on stone. He noticed when she was tired and found some reason to give her an easier day without framing it as accommodation. He noticed when she was interested in something and found ways to put that thing within her reach. She had made an offhand remark about the mathematics of the ranch's supply management, and a week later she found a copy of a bookkeeping manual on the kitchen table with a note in his handwriting that said simply, "Thought you might find this useful." She had sat with that note for longer than was rational, reading his handwriting, which was plain and clear, and said exactly what it needed to say. They talked in the evenings more often as October deepened. It was not the conversation of people performing getting to know each other. It was the conversation of two people who had discovered, with some private surprise, that they thought well in proximity to each other. They talked about the ranch and the territory and the various political upheavals of the period, which were many and complex. The Lincoln County War only 3 years past, and its ripples still moving through the social landscape of New Mexico. They talked about books, because Homer read seriously and without apology, which she found immediately appealing. They talked about cattle prices and the railroad's gradual approach to the territory, and what it would mean for a ranching operation of his size when it arrived. They did not talk about her past. He never raised it. And the not raising of it was itself a kind of intimacy, more careful and more considered than any direct inquiry would have been. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments throughout the day. She found herself constructing the things she would tell him that evening, the shape of a conversation, the exchange of ideas. She found herself aware of him in the yard, the sound of his voice giving instructions, the particular way he moved, efficient and unhurried. She recognized all of this for what it was, and regarded it with a wary and complicated feeling, because it was exactly the kind of feeling that had, in her experience, a tendency to create vulnerabilities that other people could exploit. And because her history, the history she had no story for and no references from, had been substantially shaped by the exploitation of exactly those vulnerabilities. She had been 22 when she went to work for Gerald Ashworth in St. Louis in the summer of 1879. She had taken the bookkeeping position because it paid well, and because she was good with numbers, and because she had been too young and too confident to properly assess the warning signs that were, in retrospect, visible from some distance. Ashworth ran a legitimate-seeming import business that was structured, she came to understand gradually, and then all at once, as a vehicle for laundering money from a land fraud operation that stretched across 3 territories. She had kept his books for 8 months before the ledger entries she was recording began to form a picture she could not ignore. When she told him she was leaving, he had made it clear, with the particular soft-voiced menace of a man accustomed to being accommodated, that her departure would need to be managed carefully, and that she should not expect to find employment in St. Louis again, and that if she spoke about what she had learned, her own role in the bookkeeping would be characterized in a way that would leave her exposed. She had left anyway in the night, with what she could carry, and she had been moving since. She had stopped in Kansas City for 6 months, then Denver for 4. She had tried twice to establish herself somewhere long enough to accumulate references and had been found each time, not dramatically, but found nonetheless, a letter arriving at her employer, a man appearing at the place where she worked asking polite questions, the net of Ashworth's influence reaching further than it should have been able to. He was not behind her now. She was almost certain of it. New Mexico Territory in 1883 was far enough and obscure enough from the circuits of St. Louis commerce that she had stopped flinching at every unfamiliar face in a doorway. But the absence of references was the necessary cost of that safety, and it was a cost she had accepted. She had not, in the accepting of it, expected to meet a man who would ask for neither. The nearest she came to telling Homer any of this was on a Thursday evening in the third week of October, when the first real cold of the season came in off the mountains, and they sat by the fire in the main room with books that neither of them was entirely attending to. He had asked her, not about her past, but about the future in a general way, what she wanted from it, where she hoped to be in 5 years. She had been quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking about it rather than constructing a deflection. "Somewhere I don't have to keep moving," she said finally. "Somewhere that feels like mine." He looked at the fire. "You've been moving a while," he said, not a question. "Yes." "Something chasing you," he said, also not a question. "Something I left behind," she said. "Not chasing anymore, I don't think, but it made the leaving necessary." He nodded slowly with the face of a man who is accepting information at face value because he has decided to extend exactly that much trust. "You'll know when it's settled," he said. "I think so," she said. He turned a page in his book, which he was not reading. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, with a flatness that made the sentence sound like a statement of geographic fact rather than anything more weighted. "This land was my father's and it'll be my children's someday if I have them. I'm as settled as a man can be." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. The line of his jaw was lit on one side by the firelight and the rest of him was in shadow, and she thought with a clarity that was somewhat alarming that she was in very serious trouble in the direction of this man. She said nothing. She turned back to her book. He said, not looking up, "It's a good place to stop moving is all I'm saying." She said, "I'm starting to think so." And that was as close as either of them came, that evening, to saying what they were actually talking about. Vera Crane visited twice more in the following 2 weeks, and each time she arrived with a social purpose that was transparently a reconnaissance mission. She was not stupid. She had assessed the situation and she was recalibrating her approach, trying to determine the exact nature of the territory she was competing for and the exact degree of threat that Mamie represented. She was pleasant to Mamie's face, and she asked careful questions that were designed to solicit confirmable facts, and she was always watching Homer for evidence of some particular regard that she could measure and respond to. What she saw, Mamie suspected, was not encouraging to her, because what she saw was Homer treating Mamie with an attention and a naturalness that was distinct from the courteous warmth he directed at Vera herself. With Vera, Homer was kind and familiar, the warmth of long neighborly regard. With Mamie, he was something else. He was the version of himself that existed when he was not managing his public presentation, the version that read by firelight and said quiet, true things without decorating them. Vera saw this. Vera was not, ultimately, a woman who suffered from a lack of perception. She suffered from a surfeit of intention, which is a different problem. And then it was the last week of October, and Vera arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon when Homer was out at a far pasture and not expected back for several hours. And she walked through the front door of the ranch house with a pistol at her hip that she pulled before Mamie could say a word of greeting. And she made her speech about no references and no story. And then Homer stepped through the door behind Mamie, and the scene completed itself the way it was always going to complete itself. Because Homer Talbot was not a man whose mind was changed by the presentation of evidence that his instincts had already evaluated. After Vera left, after Homer had walked her to her buggy with the quiet courtesy of a man drawing a line without making it theatrical, he came back inside and found Mamie at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of water and a steadiness in her expression that was the result of considerable internal effort. He sat across from her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He put his elbows on the table and looked at her with the full, patient attention that was, she had come to understand, simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. The gun was never going to fire, he said. Vera is angry, not reckless. She made a point. She made it badly, but she made it. I know, Mamie said. Do you want to tell me anything about what she said? He asked. About the references. About whatever made the references impossible. She looked at him. The late afternoon light was coming in through the kitchen window, casting that particular October gold across the table between them, and his face was open and patient and undemanding in a way that was more unsettling than any pressure would have been. There's a man in St. Louis, she said. His name is Gerald Ashworth. I worked for him for 8 months, keeping his books. His books were a record of things he didn't want recorded, and when I left, he made sure I understood that my previous employment at his business would be characterized in a damaging way if I gave him as a reference. Everyone I worked for before him is too far back and too long ago to be useful. I've been moving for 4 years trying to get far enough away from him that I could stop, and I think I'm far enough now, but the moving left me without a clean history. She said it the way she had rehearsed it, quietly and factually, without embellishment or self-pity. Homer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of business?" "Land fraud," she said. "I didn't know it was. I figured it out, and that's when I left." "And he threatened you?" "Yes." He sat back. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "He's got no reach out here," he said. "New Mexico territory might as well be the moon from the perspective of a St. Louis businessman, and even if he did, what you've described doesn't put you at fault for anything." "I know that," she said. "It took me a while to know it, but I know it now." He nodded. "Vera won't cause real trouble," he said. "She's angry and she thought she had a prior claim on a situation that was never what she imagined it to be. She'll settle." Mamie looked at him. "What situation?" she asked. He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his expression shifted from its usual careful equilibrium into something more direct and more vulnerable. "This one," he said. "Whatever this is that we've been building here for the past month. I don't know what to call it, and I'm not going to name it before you're ready for it to have a name. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know it's here." She looked at her hands around the water cup. Her heart was doing something large and distracting in her chest. "I haven't let anything be mine in a long time," she said. "Not people, not places. It seemed safer not to." "I know," he said. "I can see that in you. I've been watching it since the first day. And you didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to say something about," he said. "Your reasons are your reasons. My job was just to be a place that didn't move while you figured out if you wanted to stop." She looked up at him. He was watching her with those steady, serious eyes, and she thought about all the things she had been running from and all the distances she had covered, and the particular truth that she was sitting in a kitchen in New Mexico territory in the last week of October 1883, tired of moving, looking at a man who had asked her for nothing, and given her something she had not known she was missing. "Homer," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'd like to stop," she said. He did not say anything immediately. He stood up from the table and walked around it, and when he reached her chair he offered his hand, not dramatically, just his hand, open and honest, and she took it and stood, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her for a long moment. And then he said, "Good," with a quiet finality that made it sound like the settling of something long unsettled. He kissed her the way she had somehow known he would, without haste, without performance, with the thoroughness of a man who is paying genuine attention to what he is doing. Was, she thought, the most honest kiss she had ever been part of, and she had been kissed before by men who had more experience and considerably less sincerity. When he stepped back, his hand still around hers, he said, "I'll need to talk to Vera." "She'll be hurt," Mamie said. "Yes," he said. "That's going to be hard, but it's harder if I let it go longer." He squeezed her hands once and let them go. "Will you stay for supper? I mean, obviously you'll stay for supper, but I mean." He stopped. She had not seen him uncertain before. It was unexpected and entirely disarming. "I mean, will you stay?" he said. "Not as the housekeeper, as someone who's decided to stop moving." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. He laughed, and it was a good laugh, short and genuine, the laugh of someone who finds something actually funny rather than socially appropriate. "No," he said. "I suppose they're not." He drove out to Vera Crane's property the following morning alone, and he was gone for 3 hours. Mamie did not know what was said and never asked. He came back quieter than when he left, with the contained expression of a man who has done something necessary and painful, and is now integrating it. He said supper smelled good and went to wash up, and she let him have the quiet because she understood that it was not about her. What she learned later, piecemeal from the flow of town talk that reached even remote ranches, was that Vera had been genuinely angry and genuinely hurt, and had initially characterized Mamie to several people in Dustfall in terms designed to create social suspicion. But Vera Crane was also, underneath the anger and the thwarted expectation, a woman with enough self-possession to eventually recognize that Homer's clarity on the subject was absolute, and that there was no advantage in pursuing a campaign against a woman who was going to be a fixture in Homer Talbot's life, regardless of what Vera said about her references. The campaign lasted approximately 2 weeks. And then it subsided, because Vera was too intelligent and too fundamentally decent to maintain an ugly posture that was producing no useful result, and because life on the frontier was too demanding to spare much energy for sustained social warfare. November came in cold and bright, the mountains to the west carrying snow now, the air at the ranch dry and sharp and thin. The cattle were moved to winter pasture, the last of the fall work completed, the rhythm of the ranch shifting to its slower winter pattern. The hands who stayed on for winter were a smaller crew, steady men who had been with Homer for years. The house was warm because the fireplaces in the main room and the kitchen were substantial, and Homer kept them fed. In November, they began the project of actually knowing each other. Not the careful, surface-grazing conversation of the first weeks, but the deeper and less edited exchange of two people who have decided to invest in each other and are now conducting the real inventory of what they have to offer. They talked about their childhoods. Homer had grown up on this land, had watched his father build the operation from a narrow and difficult beginning into something viable. His mother had died of a fever when he was 9. He had a sister in Denver whom he saw once a year when travel permitted and corresponded with the rest of the time. He had been engaged briefly in his late 20s to a woman who had decided that the ranch was too isolated and the life too hard, and she had gone back east, and he had respected her honesty about it even though it had been a hard thing to absorb. Mamie talked about Kentucky, which she had left at 18 with her father's blessing and a very small amount of money, because her father, who had been a schoolteacher, was dying of a slow lung ailment, and had insisted that she go build something before the obligation of his care consumed the years she needed for starting. He had died 6 months after she left, cared for by neighbors, and she had not been able to get back for the burial, and this was something she carried in a quiet and permanent way that she rarely examined directly, because examining it still hurt in a way that other things had stopped hurting. Homer listened to that without trying to fix it. He said he was sorry. He said his mother's grave was on the property and he found it easier, knowing where she was. He said these things without converting them into advice, which was the correct response and not the most common one. She was aware, as the weeks passed, of falling more completely and less reversibly in love with this man, and she was aware of it with the wide-eyed and slightly frightened attention of someone who has spent years treating love as a risk rather than a resource. The love was not grand or turbulent. It had none of the melodrama that she associated with her earlier experiences of wanting someone, the overwrought urgency, the performance of feeling. It was quiet and very large, the way the sky over the ranch was quiet and very large, present in all directions and requiring no explanation. He loved her back. She could see it in the details of how he was around her, the specific quality of his attention, The way the ranch house had become a place where two people lived rather than a place where one person worked and another was employed. He asked her opinion on things, not as courtesy, but because he wanted to know what she thought. He told her things he had not said to anyone else, small and private observations about his own uncertainties, the difficulty of carrying the responsibility for the land and the men, and the future that his father had handed him. He was not a man who performed strength. He was a man who had developed it through ordinary necessity, and who trusted her enough to let the ordinary necessity show. In December, on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was doing extraordinary things with snow clouds above the mountains and the kitchen smelled of the dried apple pie she had learned was his particular weakness, he asked her to marry him. He asked it at the kitchen table, which was exactly right, in the same plain way he said everything that mattered to him, without ceremony or staging. He said he understood that she might need more time, and that he was not making the question contingent on any particular timeline. He said he was asking because he knew his own mind and he thought she should know it. She said yes. She said it immediately and without qualification, and then she said, "I don't have anything, Homer. I don't have family here or property or a clean history or references." "I have references for you," he said. 6 weeks of them, 2 months now, from me personally. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere deep and releases something that has been held for a long time. He smiled at her across the table, and it was the particular smile that she had come to understand was his real one, the one he did not deploy for social occasions, and she thought that she had somehow, in the course of running away from everything she feared, run directly toward the thing she had needed. They were married in February of 1884. In the Dustfall church, which was small and wooden, and had a stove that the minister kept at a roaring temperature against the winter. The ceremony was attended by Homer's hired men, by Aldous Fitch from the general store, who had become friendlier since Mamie had proven herself a reliable and substantial purchaser, and by Homer's sister Clara, who had come down from Denver on the southbound train, and who embraced Mamie with the particular warmth of a woman who has been hoping for exactly this development for a long time, and wants to make sure the new arrival understands she is welcome. Clara Talbot was 32 and bright and a little formidable, and she took Mamie's hands in hers at the reception dinner at the Creosote Arms and looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who loves her brother enough to be honest. "He never talked about anyone before," Clara said. "Not like this. He doesn't say much in general," Mamie said. "No," Clara said, "but what he says matters, and what he said about you matters more than anything he said about anything in years." She squeezed Mamie's hands. "I don't care where you came from. I care that you're here." Mamie had to look away briefly, because her eyes were doing something she had not entirely authorized. Vera Crane did not attend the wedding. She had not been invited, which was both correct and understood by everyone in Dustfall to be the only possible decision. What happened instead was that Vera sent a note to the ranch 2 weeks after the wedding, addressed to both of them, which said, in careful and clearly labored handwriting, that she wished them well and that she was sorry for the unpleasantness in October. It was not effusive and it was not entirely without residual pain, but it was honest, and Homer read it twice and then said he would reply and thank her, which he did. It was, Mamie reflected, a good place to be from. A place where even the wounded people eventually found their way to something decent. Spring came to the Talbot ranch the way it came to that country generally, not gradually, but in a sudden insistence, the sage turning vivid and the grass showing improbably green along the creek beds and the air losing its winter edge overnight, as if a decision had been made at altitude and communicated to the valley without negotiation. Mamie had been at the ranch through the fall and the winter, and she had come to understand the landscape in the way that a person only understands a landscape when they have watched it through all its changes. The spring version of it was the most unexpected, because the dry country she had arrived to in October had seemed to declare that color was not one of its offerings, and the spring flatly contradicted that declaration with an abundance of wildflower and revived grass that was something close to argument. She was also, in the spring, pregnant. She told Homer on a Tuesday morning in April when the light was coming in sideways through the kitchen window, and she had been feeling strange for 2 weeks, and had finally admitted what the strangeness was. He was eating breakfast and he put his fork down and looked at her with an expression that started as something carefully contained, and then broke open into something she had not seen on him before, a kind of unguarded and enormous happiness that was all the more affecting for how rarely it appeared. He came around the table and put his hands on her face and looked at her for a moment, and then he kissed her forehead and her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "A little strange in the mornings. We'll get a doctor out from Dustfall," he said. "Dr. Hennessy is good. We'll have him come regularly." "Homer," she said. "It's a pregnancy, not a catastrophe." "No," he agreed. "It's the opposite of a catastrophe." He said it with a wonder that was entirely sincere, and she loved him with a straightforwardness and a depth that had no edges she could find. He wrote to Clara that week, and Clara wrote back a letter so enthusiastic that it occupied 4 pages and included specific and detailed opinions on names, which Clara clearly had been saving for exactly this circumstance. Dr. Hennessy, who was a careful and competent man, came out from Dustfall and confirmed the pregnancy, and gave Mamie the kind of practical advice that reflected his experience with frontier conditions, less romantic than a city physician might have been, but considerably more realistic. He said she was healthy, and the pregnancy showed no complications, and that everything appeared to be proceeding as it should. He said he would make himself available at short notice when the time came. The summer was the best one Mamie could remember having, and she had to search back a long way before she could find a competitor. She was large with pregnancy by July, and the ranch was in its full summer operation, the cattle fat and the grass holding better than it had the previous year. Homer was around more than the season strictly required, because he had quietly reorganized the distribution of work in a way that allowed him to be closer to home more consistently, and because he was managing, with only partial success, the tendency to monitor her with the slightly anxious attention of a man who has something precious, and is very aware that the world is full of things that can damage what you love. She told him gently that she was fine and that the excessive watching was sweet, but that she was a capable woman, and he could trust her to be aware of her own condition. He acknowledged this with the expression of a man who agrees intellectually and is going to keep watching anyway. She found him charming in this, which was not a complication she had anticipated when she thought about the qualities she found appealing in him. Their son was born in November of 1884, 13 months after Mamie had stepped off the southbound stage in Dustfall with a carpetbag and $17, and no references and no story she wanted to tell. He was born in the bedroom of the ranch house, with Dr. Hennessy in attendance and Homer in the next room being, by the doctor's subsequent account, the most usefully prepared man the doctor had attended at a birth in 30 years of practice, and also visibly the most frightened. Mamie was not frightened. She was concentrated in the way she concentrated on things that required her full attention, and when the boy arrived, healthy and loud and absolutely certain of his need to be heard, she felt something happen in her chest that was not like anything she had felt before, a love so immediate and so total that it was almost structural, like something had been added to the frame of her. Homer came in when the doctor permitted it and stood looking at the baby in her arms with the expression of someone who has walked up to the edge of something and found it far larger than the approach suggested. His hand on the baby's head was very careful. He said nothing for a long moment. "He looks like you," Mamie said. "He's got your eyes," Homer said. "He's got gray eyes. All babies have gray eyes." "Well," Homer said, "then he's got the right ones." They named him Thomas after Homer's father. Life reorganized itself around Thomas in the way that life reorganizes itself around an infant, with the fundamental thoroughness of a tidal chain. The ranch went on as it had, because ranches do not pause for personal events, but the texture of daily existence shifted and deepened. Mamie was tired in ways that were different from any previous tiredness, and she was happy in ways that were different from any previous happiness, and she moved through the days of that first winter of Thomas's life with the particular fierce attention of a woman who has finally arrived somewhere she intends to stay and is learning it inch by inch. Homer was, somewhat to Mamie's amusement and his own evident surprise, a natural father. He had not been certain he would be. He had said so, quietly, during the pregnancy, that he had no experience with small children and was uncertain about his capacity for the softness required. But Thomas appeared in his arms the second day and looked up at him with the unfocused and profound attention of a very new person encountering the world, and something in Homer simply settled into it, the same way he settled into any real thing that required his genuine investment. He walked the boy around the ranch, explaining things to him at length, long before Thomas could understand any of it. He carried him in the crook of his left arm while he reviewed ledgers with his right hand. He sat by the crib in the evenings and watched him sleep with a patience and a tenderness that Mamie observed from the doorway on more than one occasion and never interrupted, because it was the most private and most honest version of Homer Talbot she had access to, and it was worth watching. Clara came down from Denver in the spring of 1885 and stayed for 3 weeks, which was the longest she had visited in years, and she and Mamie established a friendship that had been implied by their initial meeting and was now confirmed as the genuine article. Clara was a woman who said what she meant and read quickly and had opinions she was not reluctant to express, and Mamie found her, after years of keeping her own counsel, an enormous relief. They talked about things that Mamie had not talked about with anyone: her years of moving, the weight of the hidden history, the strange and gradual process of learning to feel safe in a place. Clara listened without the urge to fix or minimize, which Mamie had come to understand was a Talbot family trait, this capacity for witnessing difficulty without immediately trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. "Homer told me," Clara said on one of their last evenings, "that he hired you because you were exactly what the house needed and you were the only person who came to ask for the position." "That's true," Mamie said. "He also told me," Clara said with the precise timing of a woman who knows how to land a sentence, "that he knew the first morning you sat across that table from him that he was in trouble." Mamie looked at her. "He didn't say it in those words," Clara said. "You know how he says things." "He said he knew immediately that the question was not whether she was capable, but whether she would stay. And that the whole first month he kept thinking about how to make it so she would want to stay." Mamie looked at the fire. Thomas was asleep in the other room, his small breathing audible in the particular silence of a ranch house at night. "I was afraid of him," Mamie said. "Not of him personally, of what he made me feel like, of caring that much about a person and a place when I'd been so careful not to." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now," Mamie said, "I'm afraid of different things, normal things. The weather and the cattle prices, and whether Thomas will sleep through the night." Clara laughed. "That's the best possible trade," she said. The summer of 1885 brought a letter from St. Louis. It arrived addressed to Mamie Dawson Talbot, care of the Dustfall postmaster, and she knew before she opened it what it was, because only one thing in St. Louis knew where she was, and that thing was whatever arm of Gerald Ashworth's operation had finally traced her movement to its current terminus. She opened it at the kitchen table while Thomas was asleep and Homer was in the south pasture, and she read it with the measured calm of a woman who has had 4 years to prepare for exactly this moment. The letter was not from Ashworth himself. It was from a lawyer in Albuquerque named Edmund Reese, who informed her in careful legal language that Gerald Ashworth, in the course of the federal investigation into his land fraud operation, which had been initiated in 1883 and concluded in March of 1885 with Ashworth's conviction and sentencing to 7 years imprisonment, had named Mamie Dawson as a potential material witness to certain bookkeeping practices. The federal investigator assigned to the case wished to confirm that she was aware of the conviction and to advise her that her own testimony, while potentially useful, was not legally compelled given the case had already reached its conclusion. She was free to provide a statement voluntarily if she wished, or to take no action. The matter of any implication of her own conduct in the operation had been reviewed and set aside, as there was no evidence of her knowing participation in the fraudulent scheme. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She sat for a moment in the October-warm kitchen of the Talbot Ranch house, with the smell of the cornbread she had put in the oven filling the room and Thomas's small sounds coming through the wall. Gerald Ashworth was in federal prison. She was free. Not in the abstract way she had been telling herself she was free for the past 2 years, but in the documented, legally established, formally concluded way. The thing that had been chasing her, the shadow of a threat that had driven her through Kansas City and Denver and onto a southbound stage to a town she'd never heard of, that thing was in a prison cell in Missouri, and it was going to be there for 7 years. And even when it got out, the world would know what it was. Homer found her sitting at the table when he came in for midday, and he looked at the letter on the table and at her face, and he came directly to where she was sitting and crouched down to be at her level. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, and then he read it again, and then he set it down and looked at her. "Mamie," he said. "It's over," she said. "The thing I was running from, it's actually legally finally over." He sat down across from her. He did not say "I told you so," which was never going to be something Homer Talbot said. He did not say anything dramatic. He looked at her with the steady, serious attention that she had loved from the beginning, and then he said, "How does that feel?" She thought about it. "Like putting down something heavy," she said. "Like you didn't know how heavy it was until you set it down, and now you can feel all the places in your body where you'd been compensating for the weight." "Good," he said. "That's good. I can write to people," she said with a sudden clarity that was almost giddy. "I can write to the railroad boarding house and ask for a letter. I can establish an employment history. I can have references." He looked at her with something complicated in his eyes. "You don't need them," he said. "You've never needed them, not with me." "I know," she said, "but I want them. I want to be a person who has them. I want to be a person with a history that's visible and clean." She paused. "Is that foolish?" "No," he said immediately. "That's not even a little bit foolish. That's everything you should want." She wrote the letters that week. She wrote to the woman who had run the railroad boarding house, who wrote back within a month with a reference so warm and specific that Mamie read it 3 times. She wrote to the seamstress's shop. She wrote a voluntary statement to the federal investigator in Albuquerque, not because it was required, but because she wanted the record to show clearly what she had known, and when she had left and why. And she wanted the gap in her history to have an explanation that was available in writing. The investigator wrote back to confirm receipt and to reiterate that she bore no liability in the matter. She built, over the following months, the paper trail she had been unable to have before. It was, in its way, a strange and intimate process, this reconstruction of a document itself. She had existed in the world for 28 years and had done real things and been known by real people, and now those things and those people were confirmable. She could hand someone a letter that said she was trustworthy and competent and honest, and the letter would be telling the truth. She did not need these things for Homer or for the ranch or for the life she already had. But she needed them for herself, in the way a person needs to be fully present in their own story. Thomas took his first steps in February of 1886, lurching across the main room floor toward his father's outstretched hands with the absolute conviction of someone who has committed to a project that his body has not entirely endorsed yet. And Homer caught him when he arrived, laughing in the unguarded way that Mamie still found startling and wonderful. "He walks like you," Mamie said from the doorway. "He walks like a person who's very confident and only partially in control," Homer said. "Yes," she said, Like you, he looked up at her. Is that your assessment of me? It's a complimentary assessment, he said, and Thomas, apparently done with the walking experiment, sat down on the floor with the decisive quality of someone who has made their point and is now choosing rest. By the spring of 1886, the ranch had expanded. Homer had purchased the adjacent parcel of land to the north when its previous owner, an elderly man named Darnell, decided to retire to his daughter's household in Santa Fe. It was a substantial addition to the property, and it came with its own water access, which was worth more than the land itself in the high desert country of New Mexico Territory. Homer and Mamie spent weeks walking the new acreage, discussing what it could carry, and these conversations were among the best ones Mamie could remember having, the kind where two people think together and find that the combination is better than either would have reached alone. She had become, in the 2.5 years at the ranch, a genuine partner in the operation, not in the ceremonial way that wives of proprietors were sometimes described as partners, but in the actual working sense. She managed the household accounts with the precision of someone trained in bookkeeping. She had developed relationships with the suppliers in Dustfall and the twice-yearly buyers from Albuquerque that were based on her own competence and reliability rather than on Homer's reputation. She had ideas about cattle management that she had arrived at from the outside, from reading and from watching, that Homer listened to with the same seriousness he gave any other informational source, and several of which he had implemented with good results. When Clara came for her annual visit that spring, she looked at the two of them together across the supper table, Mamie talking about the water rights on the new parcel, Homer listening and asking questions, Thomas asleep in the next room, and she had the expression of someone watching something she has waited a long time to see arrive. "You're happy," Clara said to Mamie later, in the private way of a comment rather than a question. "Ridiculously so," Mamie said. "It suits you," Clara said. "Happiness suits you in a way I imagine fear never quite fit." "No," Mamie said, "fear never fit well. It was always a borrowed thing." Clara raised her coffee cup. "To things that fit," she said. Mamie raised hers. "And to places that hold still." The next several years at the Talbot Ranch were, by the standards of the era and the country, exceptionally good ones. The cattle business shifted with the coming of the railroad to Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was close enough to matter, and Homer navigated the transition with the steady practical intelligence that characterized all his decisions, adjusting the operation's scale and focus to meet the market as it changed. The land supported the herd. The water held. The men Homer kept were good ones, the kind who stayed. Mamie and Homer had a second child in the spring of 1888, a girl they named Frances, after Mamie's mother, who had died before Mamie was old enough to carry a clear memory of her, but whose name felt like the right one to put into the future. Frances was different from Thomas from the first week, quieter and more watchful, with Homer's dark hair and Mamie's gray eyes, and the capacity to observe a room from her position in it, with a thoroughness that her father found personally familiar, and her mother found both charming and slightly alarming. Thomas, at 3.5, was not initially certain what to make of Frances, and there was a period of approximately 2 weeks during which he regarded her with the suspicious assessment of someone who suspects a significant reorganization of existing arrangements. And then he decided that she was acceptable, and after that, he was protective of her with the slightly excessive dedication of someone who has come to an independent conclusion and is now committed to it. Mamie watched her children growing and her husband working and her household running, and she was aware, in the quiet moments, of the distance between this life and the woman who had stepped off a stage in a town she'd never heard of with $17, and a name she'd borrowed from the general direction of who she used to be. The distance was vast, and it was not only geographic. It was the distance between a woman who had learned to need nothing and a woman who had allowed herself everything. She thought sometimes about the things that had been required for her to arrive here. The years of moving, the fear, the lost employment, the nameless sequence of temporary positions, all of it had been the cost of getting out from under Gerald Ashworth, and the cost had been high. But on the other side of it was this: the ranch in the afternoon light, Homer at the end of the supper table, reading, the same way he had been the first night she understood that she was falling in love with him. Thomas running across the yard with the particular reckless energy of a healthy 4-year-old. Frances watching everything from her crib with those serious, accumulating eyes. She did not think it had been worth it, because nothing that had cost what those years had cost could be called worth it. But she thought that she had made something real out of the remains of a difficult passage, and she thought that the making was its own kind of answer to what had been taken. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was not yet a state, a fact that Homer tracked with the attention of a man who understands that statehood has practical consequences for land titles and taxation, and a dozen other things that affect his operation directly. The political machinery of it moved slowly, and with the complicated friction of territorial politics, which involved enough competing interests and enough geographical reality to make any clean resolution difficult. Homer followed the newspapers and attended the occasional public meetings in Dustfall, and corresponded with a ranchers' association in Albuquerque that was lobbying for conditions favorable to established operations as statehood proceeded. New Mexico would not achieve statehood until 1912, as it turned out, and Homer would follow that process for the rest of his working life. But in 1889, he was already tracking the direction it was heading. Mamie received, in the fall of 1889, a letter from Clara in Denver that contained news she had not expected. Clara had married a man named Arthur Keeler, who was a civil engineer of some substance and considerable personal warmth, as evidenced by Clara's description of him, which occupied most of the letter's 4 pages. Mamie read the letter at the kitchen table and then took it to Homer in the main room and watched him read it, and the smile that came to his face was one of the best versions of him she knew. "She's been wanting this for years," he said. "She never said so," Mamie said. "She wouldn't," Homer said. "She'd think it was enough to want it and she'd rather build something else in the meantime." He paused. "She's a lot like you in that way." Mamie considered this. "Is that a compliment?" "Absolutely," he said, and held out the letter. "Write back and tell her we'll come to Denver in the spring for a proper celebration." They went to Denver in May of 1890, their first significant journey from the ranch since Mamie's arrival, traveling north on the train with Thomas, who was 5 and absolutely certain that the train was the most magnificent invention in human history, and Frances, who was 2, and slept through most of it with a serenity that suggested she had decided this was happening, and she might as well be comfortable. Clara met them at the station with Arthur Keeler at her side, who was tall and thoughtful, and regarded Homer with the slightly careful attention of a man meeting his new brother-in-law and hoping to be liked, and who regarded Mamie with the immediate ease of a man who had heard enough about her from Clara to already feel he knew her. The 5 days in Denver were among the happiest Mamie had spent. The city was large and busy and slightly overwhelming after years of the ranch's particular scale, and she moved through it with the interested attention of someone encountering a world they no longer entirely belong to, but can appreciate as a visitor. She and Clara walked and talked and did the things that friends who are also sisters-in-law do when they finally have uninterrupted time, and Homer and Arthur found their own comfortable territory in each other's company, which Mamie observed with the satisfaction of a woman who likes the parts of her life to fit together. The train back to Dustfall ran through the night, and she sat at the window in the sleeper car watching the darkness roll past, the children asleep in the bunks, Homer beside her reading in the lamp glow. She thought about the other train journeys she had made, the ones running away, the urgency and the fear and the strange, muted grief of leaving places before they could leave her. And she thought about this one which was going toward something, toward the ranch and the house and the life that was hers in every way a life could be someone's. She put her hand on his arm without saying anything. He looked up from his book. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "More than all right." He covered her hand with his and went back to his book, and she watched the dark country pass outside the window, and she felt, clearly and without any residual ambiguity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The winter of 1890 brought a third pregnancy, which Mamie confirmed with Dr. Hennessy in February, and she told Homer over supper on a Wednesday evening in the matter-of-fact way that things had become between them when she was certain of something that mattered. He set down his fork, same as he had with Thomas, and looked at her with that particular expression, the one that broke open into happiness from its contained beginning. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. Thomas, who was 5 and had been allowed to stay at the supper table for this announcement, said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" with the practical directness of a child who has been thinking about this question for some time. "We don't know yet," Homer said. "I want a brother," Thomas said. "I want a horse," Homer said, looking at Mamie with a composure that was entirely fabricated. Mamie looked at her son. "We'll see what arrives," she said. What arrived in September of 1890 was a boy. They named him James. He was born healthy and loud, as Thomas had been, and Thomas received this information with the satisfaction of a person whose preference has been vindicated by events, and Frances regarded her new brother with the watchful equanimity that characterized her approach to most new information. By the fall of 1890, the Talbot Ranch was, by any measure, a genuinely successful operation. Homer had built something that his father would have recognized as the fulfillment of an ambition. The cattle were strong, the land was well managed, the hands were reliable, and the accounts, which Mamie managed with the precision of someone who had come to it through difficulty and taken it seriously because of that, were in good order. The house was the kind of house that has been lived in by people who are paying attention, full of the accumulated detail of a family that is actually present to itself. Mamie looked at it sometimes, this life, with the frank and slightly wondering attention of someone who has not entirely stopped being surprised by it. She had arrived with nothing. She had offered nothing verifiable. She had been met by a man who asked for neither references nor story, with the simple and extraordinary gift of being trusted at face value. And she had built from that beginning this particular and irreplaceable version of a life. She had her story now. It was a long one, and some of it was hard, and some of it was a kind of running that had taken years off her in certain ways and given her back something essential in others. It was a story she had been willing to tell for some time, and she told parts of it to her children as they grew old enough to receive them, not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence that people move through difficult things and come out the other side into something that makes the difficulty worth surviving. Homer knew most of it. He knew it not from a single concentrated telling, but from the accumulation of evenings and years, the way a person's history becomes known to someone who is paying consistent and loving attention to them across a long stretch of time. He knew about Kentucky and the schoolteacher father and the difficult years between. He knew about St. Louis and Ashworth and the running. He knew about the $17 and the carpetbag and the particular courage it had taken to walk up to a stranger's ranch house and ask for a position she had no documentation to support. He told her, on their 10th wedding anniversary, that he thought about that morning often. The morning she had ridden up and he had looked up from the fence post-argument and seen a woman on a horse coming up the road with the bearing of someone who was going somewhere on purpose. "I knew immediately," he said. "Knew what?" she said. "That the question was not whether you were capable. I could see that you were. The question was whether you would stay." "You told Clara that," she said. He looked at her. "She told you." "Years ago," Mamie said. "She told me you knew immediately." He was quiet for a moment. "I did," he said, "and I spent the whole first month trying to figure out how to make it worth your while to stay without making it obvious that that was what I was doing." "The bookkeeping manual," she said. "Among other things," he said. She looked at him across the supper table, this man who was her husband and the father of her children and the person she had grown most fully herself in proximity to, and she thought that the best things sometimes arrived in the form of a person who asked nothing of you at the exact moment you had nothing to offer. "I'm glad I came here," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day that I have been, I'm glad about it." Thomas, who was 14 by then and had his father's height and his mother's eyes and the particular blend of their respective stubbornness that both of them recognized with a rueful admiration, came in from outside and said there was something wrong with the north fence, and Homer looked at his wife and stood and said he supposed that needed attending to, and the moment passed into the ordinary flow of an evening at the Talbot Ranch. But she held it. She put it in the part of herself where she kept the things she returned to, the particular evidence that her life had become what it had become. That first morning, the gun at her throat and Homer stepping around her like a wall. The coffee that was not good, the kitchen table, the fire in November, the way he had said, simply and with the finality of a man who knows his own mind, "I'm not going anywhere." The way she had said, simply and with the finality of a woman who has finally found the direction she wants to go, "I'd like to stop." She rose and went to the window that looked out over the yard and the cottonwood and the fence lines stretching away to the mountains. And she stood there, while Homer and Thomas walked out together toward the north fence in the long golden light of an October evening, Francis and James somewhere behind her, in the house being whatever version of themselves they were being at that particular moment. And she felt the whole of it, the weight and the warmth and the extraordinary fact of having arrived here, in this particular square of ground under this enormous and insistent sky, and having decided to stay. There were no more running days. There were no more borrowed names or temporary positions or mornings where she woke in a strange room and calculated the distance to the nearest stage route. There was this ranch and this man and these children and this life, which was hers in every documented and undocumented way, referenced and unreferenced, historical and immediate. She pressed her hand to the cool glass of the window and watched Homer and Thomas reach the fence line, watched them consult and gesture, and begin to work together the way fathers and sons who understand each other work. And she thought about all the things she had not had to explain, and all the history she had not had to produce, and the man who had looked at her across a kitchen table in October of 1883 and decided, based on nothing but what he could see directly in front of him, that this was enough. It had been enough, and from enough they had built everything. The mountains to the west were going purple in the fading light, the sky above them doing its usual extraordinary things with color, orange and rose and the deep blue of the coming evening, and Mamie Dawson Talbot stood at the window of her home and watched it all arrive, and she was, completely and without reservation, at peace.